Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the Cowabunga collection. Now, I was just the right age for this franchise when it hit. I watched the cartoon constantly. I had a whole bunch of the toys. It wouldn't be till years later when I found out there was a comic book that all of that was actually based on. What I did know about, however, was all of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle video games they made. 13 of those games are in this collection, and I was familiar with 10 of them going into this collection. Some of them I owned, some of them I rented repeatedly. So let's talk about these 13 games. Going in the order the collection presents them in. First we have Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the arcade game. This was a beat 'em up, and I remember the first day I saw one of these machines. I was already huge into the Turtles, and the fact there was a video game starring them was too much for the little version of me to handle. I spent every quarter I had that day trying to get further in this game. And yes, the beat 'em up was kind of the go-to genre when making a licensed arcade game back then, but it actually made a great deal of sense for the Turtles to be in a beat 'em up. There are 4 of them that use different weapons, so each one can play just a little differently. And in the cartoon at least, the Foot Clan are all just robots. So when you're fighting just hordes and hordes of minions, it's just, the Shredder used the Technodrome to build a whole lot of these ninja robots. So unlike some franchises that got the beat-em-up treatments, this one actually made sense in context. Next we have the arcade sequel, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Turtles in Time. Now, I saw the first arcade machine at almost every arcade I went to as a child. Turtles in Time, on the other hand, was a much more rare machine to see, at least in my experience. It plays pretty much the same as the first game, but does look a little bit nicer. And the hook with this game, as you might guess from the title, there's time travel going on. Not that it means all that much in terms of gameplay, but you might see a dinosaur in the background. Or now you're on a pirate ship. The whole time travel thing could have been sold a little more had they made the Foot Clan guys look different in the different times. You know, put little pirate hats on them or something. You know, just make it some kind of prop that's on them that would be appropriate for the time you're supposed to be in. I'm sure memory limitations at the time probably prevented anything like this from happening. Moving away from the arcade, we now have Turtles in Time, the Super Nintendo version. And I rented this game constantly. Obviously, this is a little bit of a downgrade, graphically speaking, but that's to be expected when going from the arcade to a home port at the time. But this version wasn't just a straight port. It actually had some unique levels, and also shuffled the order of some of the levels around. And if you're interested in seeing the real ending of the Super Nintendo version, you have to beat it on the hardest difficulty setting, which I did as a child, by using a Game Genie. And even with the help of the Game Genie, it was still pretty hard to do it. Next, we have another Super Nintendo game, TMNT Tournament Fighters. Fighting games blew up in the 90s because of Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat, so many franchises ended up having fighting games. And this was a game I rented quite a bit. It's also the game where I first discovered that button mashing can be an effective strategy. Because even though I was playing this game a lot, I didn't really get into fighting games till a few years later. So my understanding of how using special moves in fighting games was almost non-existent. But I figured out that if I went nuts on the control pad, that fancy things would end up happening. Coming back to this now, it's really not that good of a fighting game. And now that I know how to actually play fighting games, I've apparently lost any skill I had at button mashing, because it didn't seem to be working when I tried it here. Moving on from the Super Nintendo, we now have the Hyperstone Heist for Genesis. And this was sort of like Turtles in Time for the Super Nintendo. At least a lot of the levels were very similar, but it did have a different story going on. And it did play a little differently from the Super Nintendo game. I didn't own a Genesis as a child, but a friend of mine did. And we spent many hours trying to beat this game together. And I do prefer how this plays a little bit to Turtles in Time on the Super Nintendo. But I think in general, the Genesis did beat 'em up games just a little bit better. Next we have Tournament Fighters for the Genesis. Before playing it in this collection, I assumed this would be the same as the Super Nintendo version, with sprites that would look slightly worse, but move slightly better. It turns out that's not the case. This has a different roster of characters, and while it is still a fighting game, it plays very differently from the Super Nintendo version. I found this version to be overall much more difficult. Moving on from the Genesis, we now get the NES games, starting with a game simply called Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, a notoriously hard game. I got it as a birthday present as a child. I never came anywhere close to beating this game. The furthest I would get was the level where you have to disarm the things underwater. On a rare occasion, I could actually get through that level and see the next level, and then I'd almost immediately die. And I was a kid that was obsessed with the turtles. I tried hard to get through that game. And there were many NES games I could actually beat. This was not one of them. And looking back on it now, playing it again in this collection, this is not a good example of a NES game. And there are some absolute timeless classics for the NES, but this is a game that should just stay buried. Next we have Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, the arcade game. And this is exactly what the title says, a port of the first arcade game. Visually, this was a step down, to say the least, but the gameplay was very solid, and there were some unique levels in this version. And where the first game is very hard to the point of frustration, this game here is actually doable for most people. Sadly, did not own this as a child, though I did rent it a few times. It was really much better to play when you had a second player to play with. Next we have TMNT 3, The Manhattan Project, and this was another beat-em-up, but not based on any particular arcade game. This was a NES exclusive. Coming out a couple of years later, it looks slightly better than the last game. It, however, plays almost exactly the same. I only rented this once or twice, honestly, because I already had a Super Nintendo by the time I became aware of this game. And I think it's understandable to say that given the choice between this or Turtles in Time, I went with Turtles in Time. The last NES game in this collection is a port of Tournament Fighters. The NES wasn't exactly known for its fighting games, and so far as I can tell, you can only choose between the 4 turtles, and they seem to play exactly the same. I'm not really sure why this exists, and I'm not sure it ever really needed to. The last 3 games in this collection are for the Game Boy, starting with TMNT, Fall of the Foot Clan, and this is a pretty simplistic game. You walk and rarely jump in levels, and you take out Foot Clan guys with one hit. Eventually, you fight bosses with very simple patterns. It is very simplistic, and even had I played this as a child, I doubt it would have held my attention. Moving on to its sequel, Back from the Sewers, it's more of the same from the first game, but the graphics look different, and I'm not sure if they're slightly better or slightly worse. The Game Boy was capable of so much more than these 2 games. Moving on, the final game in this collection is Radical Rescue for the Game Boy. And it is absolutely nothing like those first 2 Game Boy games. This is actually sort of an early Metroidvania. When you start the game, you can only play as Michelangelo, and you have to save the other 3 turtles. After you save one of them, you can freely switch between the turtles. And each one of the turtles has a different unique ability that allows you to access more parts of the map. And I really wish I would have known about this game as a child. This would have been amazing on long car trips. A while back, I actually did a review of this game. And I am so very happy that I got to end this collection on something of a high note. Overall, the Cowabunga collection is pretty worthwhile. There really was a lot more diversity in terms of Ninja Turtle games than one would probably expect. And for anyone that's around my age, playing through this collection is going to be a great nostalgia trip, I'm sure. Please do subscribe, comment, like, and tell your friends.